definition of sales enablement has changed. What are the components of sales enablement has changed as recently as the last year, right? And so there are many people who they need one piece of it, they don't need another piece of it. And so what we've seen is, just now it's starting to sort of cross the chasm. But even in, recent years, there are people like, we really think it's a great idea. We think we're going to be ready for it, but we've decided not to do it until next year. It's kind of like the story you told earlier, right? Sometimes the decision, despite the best efforts, some percentage of those people aren't going to close and the deal is not going to happen. It's not a function per se of a bad experience, although certainly in many cases it is.
Hi, friends. Welcome to the Sales Enablement Podcast. I'm your host, Andy Paul. That was Mark Magnacca. Mark is the president and co-founder of Allego, which is the enterprise video knowledge platform. And in our conversation today, we're talking about topics related to his new book, the book he co-authored, that's titled Mastering Virtual Selling, Orchestrating Sales Success. So we start off with a good definition of virtual selling. From the book, Mark says, being a great virtual seller means understanding a prospect's mindset when you're not meeting with him or her in person. And the reason I like that, because I think that's always been the case in sales. That's where the difference is made in terms of, it's not just what you do when you're in front of the buyer, but as Mark and I dig into in our conversation, it's what you think about, plan, and do when you're not in front of the buyer that differentiates you and makes the difference. As Mark writes in his book, virtual selling is learning how to become a maestro, a master of orchestrating all the moving parts in the buying process to achieve the outcome you want. And we dig into how you can become that maestro and much, much more. Now, before we get to Mark, I want to remind you to subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen to it. And if you subscribe, we'd certainly appreciate it if you could leave us a review, give us your feedback about how we're doing. So thank you. All right, let's jump into it. So of the three imperatives that you have for the sellers have these days, we talked about building rapport, and then second one was understanding and solving customer problems. So this one is near and dear to my heart. So you wrote that the ability to understand the buyer's problem is fundamental to mastery. And you talk, I like this part. You said it's easy to think you know what is most important to a buyer from a first impression or a snippet of a conversation, which I think is the problem, is that sellers operate on assumptions.
I agree. Yeah, no question about that.
I mean, I believe that there's this gap that exists between knowing something and understanding it. And this is a chasm that sellers fall into all the time with sort of the overly scripted questions and playbooks, is that they don't oftentimes cross that chasm. And as a result, they really can't help the customer solve the problems because they don't really understand what they are.
Yeah, I would tell you, Andy, that the interesting thing that's relevant to what you're describing here is that this whole notion of listening it's just critical. And what's really changed from my perspective is that, especially coming out of the pandemic, is a realization that we don't need a lot of the tools and techniques of the past. If you think about in many ways, so Andy, if we pick it up with your question around understanding the buyer's problem and really thinking about what's important to a customer, one of the things that we're seeing that the pandemic has really helped accelerate is when you can use a tool like conversation intelligence to assess how much you're talking versus how much you're listening. It's incredibly revealing. I think for so many people with I'll call it a traditional sales personality that has some level of extroversion, it's easy to be almost in a flow state when you're talking, right? A lot of us, myself included, actually think best when we're talking. So there's other people, as you know, who conceptualize and they think very much internally, and then only when they've collected all their thoughts do they say what they're going to say. And there's another group of us who's not like that. And so one of the things that
I think best in the shower, by the way.
So do I. I literally if I had I heard Lionel Richie say the same thing, by the way, that the lyrics come to him in the shower more often than not, right?
Well, I used to have a pad in my shower, one of these erase things you can write on. I didn't use it as much as I thought, but yeah, I'm always very conscious of, okay, Make sure you remember this.
Do you know how many times I've forgotten? Yeah, I've had 3 things in my head. I'm drying off. I'm like, okay, I got to go write those down.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think one of the big dynamics, in fact, I just was part of a roundtable with a McKinsey consultant who was covering some research on this topic. And what he said was the whole model of selling that was really buyer versus seller. There was all of this tension. If you think about, the challenger notion, and we've got to create this dynamic. We're going to challenge you. We're going to do all of these different things to sort of, in a sense, create uncomfortable energy between us that we can then relieve at some point, almost like a comedian sets up a joke, right?
Yes.
Well, what we're realizing now is when someone's done 60 or 70% of the research before, now they have an overall framework in many cases. And, Forrester and so many are saying like, that's what they're doing. 2/3, 60 to 70% of research is happening before they even get on the phone with you or they get onto a Zoom call. So you're not dealing with somebody that those techniques, which served a purpose in their time, I think in some ways they're an anachronism now. So,
I mean, I would argue they never had a place and they were always an anachronism, but yeah, go ahead.
well, I think if you look back, you recognize that, taken to the extreme, there was sort of the aluminum siding, like in the movie Tin Men. You know what I mean? There was these parodies of that kind of the high pressure model. But what I've realized, at least in my own development over this period of time, is that that's just not how people want to buy, myself included. And so I've come to the conclusion, if I don't want to buy that way, pretty good chance that you don't either. So I need to adapt my approach accordingly. And I know at Allego anyway, a big part of our whole model is absolutely operating under the premise that we're here to help you make a better buying decision. And quite frankly, if based on your needs, a better buying decision is to don't buy us, we'd literally rather give you a fond farewell and point you in the direction we think could benefit you, knowing that it's a small world and at some point you may end up coming back to us as your needs change.
Yeah, well, I think this speaks to sort of, you talked about the various sales religions that have existed, these, methodologies, Sandler, whatever. And I think it's always been the shortcoming of those, as well as others, not to call them out specifically, is in the way they're presented is that, part of the reason buyers have these opinions of sellers as, pushy and, clueless and uninformed and so on and so forth is that that's sort of the way we create sellers.
That was true. No, it was no question. It was true.
I don't put it in the past tense. I think that's happening, and I think it's perhaps worse than it's been. As someone who's been through several generations of sellers, it's certainly no better, and I think in some respects it's worse. So, we basically teach sellers that, hey, your job, if you were to ask most sellers, and I do this when I talk in public, what's your job as a salesperson? And invariably, the answer comes down to something that's one variety of, well, my job is to persuade someone to buy my product. And which I think is not their job. I think my job and your job as a seller is to listen, to understand what's most important to the buyer, and then help them get that. And if you have one perspective, you think it's persuasion-based, you're going to undertake a certain set of actions, behaviors that result in this, what I call selling out. Whereas if you think your job is to listen, understand what's most important to this other person and help them get it, then you're going to act in a completely different way.
I love it. And I have to tell you, Andy, I know we just touched on it earlier, but that is the most important question. I discovered that question when I was 23 years old, and it's been one of the most important questions in my entire career.
Yeah.
That one question. And then, there's a couple even separate layers to it, right? So there's what's most important to you when you blank. And then, depending upon the answer to that question, there's what has to happen for you to know that, right? So I used to do this in the investment business before I was in the software business. And I would ask people, what's most important to you when you make an investment decision? Pause. And I would be quiet. And they would talk. And they would say something like safety, the rate of return. They would give me an answer. And then I would say, well, what has to happen for you to know that you've gotten a good return, as you put it? Well, I have to earn 20% of my money. Oh, okay. Now I know what I'm dealing with. Then I say to him, my last question, Andy, along that trifecta was, have you had an experience in the past when you've worked with somebody that you've been happy with?
Mm.
And that was a really powerful question, because when people say
It's a
no, I think
powerful question.
they're all jerks. Okay, and I would tell them, what are the odds that I come along now, and you've been doing this a long time, and all of a sudden it's totally different, right? And so then it's a little bit of a strip line, and this goes back to where there's some value to the techniques. There's like, I liken it to magic, in the sense that there are skills that you can practice that evoke certain parts of the process, especially for people who are sort of naturally recalcitrant. And you have to remember also that there's different people at different in different psychological states in the moving parade of life, that, at least in my experience on this, if there's not some situational prompter, all things being equal, something like 50% of people will do nothing, right? Even if they've told you it's important. So that's why I think it's a 1-2 punch. And I will tell you that, from my perspective, what we've done better, at least I can only speak for my own company, but what we've done better than what we've done in the past is, my team does its homework on you before they call you. They wouldn't, if they called you up and they didn't know that you were an author, and they didn't know that you have a podcast, and we listened to that call, there's a problem. There's a problem. Yeah.
And it's shocking how many times that happens.
I bet it happens to me too.
I've said before in the show, I get people cold outreach to me saying, we've looked at your profile. We think you should have a podcast.
Andy, I've had it from my direct competitor. Literally, one of my direct competitors, their SDR outreach to me was, have you considered a sales enablement platform? We had some fun with that one, sending it around, because I'm like, dude, I mean, come on.
I would have called his boss if I were you, just out of professional courtesy, just to say, hey, though they don't always respond well when you do that. I've done that with people. But I mean, for me, people have to have the right perspective on what they're doing and what their job is. And to me, everything flows from there, right? If we see, low win rates and high no decision rates and so on, it flows back to the experience of the buyer with the seller.
Right. No, there's no question about that.
And so, I've asked the question of managers. So, are you measuring the buyer experience with your sellers? No. Yeah. Okay. So what are you measuring? Oh, and how many calls they make? Sure, you get a sense of it when you're listening to recorded calls with a conversational intelligence system, but are you asking the question? Are you finding a way to measure and to compare, even if it's a soft measure, just to be able to compare to what it was a month ago or 2 months ago or a year ago?
Yep.
Because this fundamentally drives a decision.
I absolutely agree with that. And, there are certain airlines. One I'm partial to is JetBlue.
Me too.
So they're just, so am I. And so they are really good, I think, at doing that. And I've had, I fly on them a lot. Things have happened, and, I've called, and they've been really, really good about making me feel like they want me to have a good experience. And if I didn't, then they want to help make it right. And, sometimes, I mean, we had one time a thing happened on the plane, and it wasn't the flight attendant's fault. It's just one of those things. And she just came over to my wife and she said, you know what? I can't do anything about the fact that your TVs aren't working. She's like, I know it's part of the JetBlue experience. She's like, I wish I could do something, but I tell you what, I brought you each one of these mini bottles of champagne. Maybe you could just enjoy a drink on me. And it was like, my wife and I drank the champagne. It was only like an hour left in the flight. It was like, that's all we needed. And it turned out to be a great experience. Not every airline, as you know, does that.
Well, JetBlue, yes, in person they do a great job. Their website sucks.
It crashes a lot, right?
but in person they do a great job.
So Andy, can I just go back one thing though, because I'm really interested, just to go one step, double click on this one. I know how I use the question, what's most important? Can you say a little bit more about what was the origin of you starting to use that, and how do you recommend people use it? Because I'm personally interested.
Well, the origin was that early in my career, about 500 years ago, I I was selling computer systems, pretty good sized computer systems to construction industry.
Okay.
And we had this one deal. It was a big deal in today's dollars, well over $1 million. It's for big system. All is basically an accounting system, job cost accounting, and so on for construction industry. Yep. So every general ledger module plus cost accounting they wanted to do. It was in their RFI, RFQ, and we did these extensive demos on multiple occasions of all the modules. Then, I don't know, 3-6 months after the system was been installed and they were using it, I was calling on the CEO and I said, you're only using invoicing. He goes, oh yeah, that's how we're paying for the whole thing. I said, you son of a bitch, we went through, 20 rounds of demos and all these applications. He said, yeah, well, you could have asked.
Wow.
Right? And it's been true every single opportunity I've worked on throughout my career, whether it's a, $100,000 system or $100 million system that I've sold. There's always one thing that's more important than all the others.
Yep. And
it's your job to find out what those are and what that is, because that's how you're going to win the deal.
Yeah.
And it's been reliable. So for me, it's like, I started being sensitized to it really early on because, and then as I look back after, I got even more experiences, like, every single time there's always one thing.
So in a sense, if you boil down what you just said, it's almost like the 80-20 principle inherent in a question, because by asking people, it forces them in a sense to synthesize and answer the question, because things are not equally important. And the other modules that you had, just like in our software, may not be important to you. I know, there's it's like, what's most important to me in Microsoft Word? Spell check, right? There's a lot of other things that are in I don't actually care about.
Yeah, what I was oftentimes throughout my career dealing and selling systems that, the customer and buyer would look at, everybody in the market, and they'd eventually winnow it down to the final two, and they'd do a big RFP, right, for the final two. And I remember this one time, it was with a company, this huge cruise line in Asia, and this was going to be the first high-speed internet. This was a few years ago, to cruise ships that they could have in the room, and as well as voice over IP and so on. And the compliance matrix that was in the RFQ and the RFP was huge, hundreds of line items. and we were, a startup, basically a little mature startup, but competing against huge system integrators. And I looked at this compliance matrix and turned to the seller that was on my team. I said, these are not all equally weighted. I said, which one's the most important to this company? And he didn't know, but he found out, to his credit.
He told you?
Is that, he asked the CEO of the company, and he didn't really care about, internet browsing in the staterooms or voice over IP. He wanted to make sure that the link from the ship to his office that gave him the real-time take on the onboard casinos never went down.
Wow.
That's all he cared about. Everything else was nice. This was important. And so we basically started ignoring most everything in the compliance matrix in our final proposal and focused just on that. 80% of the proposal was about how we'd make sure that never happened. They never had access to that information. And we won the deal.
That's a very cool story. And it, in my last book, Andy, the reason I was asking about this is a topic of great interest to me. I actually called what you just described the so what benefit. And the book was called So What? And so the so what benefit was literally what you just said. It was the one thing that you could fill in the blank with this sentence. All I really care about is ... And if they could answer that question, all I really care about is a direct line from the cruise ship to the shore so that I can, and it's true with cars, it's true. And so many of us, we get distracted like a bull by the matador, red flags going all these different ways, and we're running around instead of realizing, wait a minute, what's most important. So I love the phrase. I want to ask you one other thing, because I love the title.
And just before you go on, is you have to remember as a seller, you're not have to sell everything, right? This is the default position is, well, I've got all these great features. Let me sell them. It's like, no, find out what's most important to the buyer, then work on that. Anyway, go ahead.
I never thought of the term sellout until I saw the cover of your book. And I never thought about the pejorative element that the word, selling has its own baggage. But to be a sellout is like it's a much heavier indictment, right? If that guy's a sellout, right? What do you know? What's the origin of that? Why do we call it that?
I don't know. People selling out as an expression. I should look that up. I'm sure somebody else will ask it. I'll have to learn that. But I was just telling somebody the story is how the title originated for the book is I had written the book and just sort of down to the final chapters, sort of summarizing everything. And I wasn't happy with the title I had. And my editor wasn't happy with the title I had. And she suggested it.
Really?
Yeah. She said, well, having read all this, it's like, how about sell without selling out? It's like, oh, that's it.
It's got a wonderful provocative element to it, right?
Right. And I'm forever indebted to her because she could see the forest for the trees at that point where I was too deeply into it.
Yeah, that's great.
But it's along the lines of what we were just talking about is it's how we socialize sellers. And it's, the point I make in the book is the behaviors that we don't like, that buyers don't like, and the ones that sellers don't like to take. Those are learned behaviors that the qualities I talk about in my book of connection, curiosity, understanding, and generosity, those are innate behaviors. And this is the way people don't come into sales being salesy. They come into sales being humans. So let's talk about how we can emphasize the human aspect of it to help them understand what's most important to the buyers and help them get it.
So connection, curiosity,
understanding, and generosity.
Understanding and generosity. Got it. Well, and it's interesting if you play that out. If you think about if a family member of yours was buying, whether it's a computer or they're buying a car, and you were selling that thing, the way that you would approach it would be, well, what do I know about them? How do I want them to feel? And so we all know how to do it. It's just that sometimes I think in a quota-based environment, there's this sense of that's how I'm supposed to behave most of the time, but I'm up against quota right now, and for this month I got to drop it.
Well, yeah, that's why change really needs to start at the top.
Yeah,
because we were all young people in sales at one point or another, and we're put into the spot of having to act in a way that A, we didn't like at all, and B, that was going to trash our relationship with the buyer. And, the one I allude to early in the book is in one sentence story is I had a client that had promised a big order before the year end. We didn't need it. Technically we didn't need it before year end, but obviously, my boss wanted it for his bonus. The guy had said he was going to send us the order before he took Christmas break. Didn't come across. I had to call the guy at home on Christmas Eve in the midst of opening presents, to ask him to fax an order to us. And this is not unusual. This happens all the time.
Yeah.
We tell the buyer, look, we're here to help until it gets to the last week of the month or last week of the quarter. And then it's like, what can we do to get you in this car today? In essence, right? And then, what do you do? Well, they may still buy from you, but from that point forward, the relationship's different. Yeah,
it's a great point.
And this happens repeatedly. So if we want things to change, it's like, I ask as in a roundtable discussion with a bunch of sales leaders, and they're talking about spiffs, and they're talking about, last week of the month. And I said, well, let me ask you the question. Have you ever done an ROI calculation on giving that 10% discount in the last week of the month in order to get the order in that you're going to get the next week anyway? No. Okay. Well, how about a return on investment on the spiff you gave your seller to close that order that last week of the month? Ever done an ROI calculation on that? No. It's like, okay, let's just give margin points away for nothing.
Right. This is what happens when you go to Stanford, Andy. This is the problem. You just know things, right?
I don't think that's nothing to do with what I learned there, but it's just stuff just doesn't make sense, and it doesn't make. We know it doesn't make sense, and it doesn't make sense anymore. And you look at the SaaS industry with what I consider really low win rates in general that are acceptable to most SaaS companies, so 20 to 25%. And you say, well, that's being driven by the experience of the buyers with your sellers. So what are we going to do different? Right? It's the buyer's referendum on you, as I like to tell sellers. It's the buyer's referendum on you, and it's personal. I mean, it doesn't mean you're a bad person, but it's they're making their judgment on on you.
Right. We also track though a no decision, right? Because one of the things that with numbers that low, one of the things you have to realize is that in some markets, and using sales enablement as a perfect example, the definition of sales enablement has changed. What are the components of sales enablement has changed as recently as the last year, right? And so there are many people who they need one piece of it, they don't need another piece of it, and so what we've seen is just now it's starting to sort of cross the chasm. But even in recent years, there are people like, we really think it's a great idea. We think we're going to be ready for it, but we've decided not to do it until next year. And so that becomes it's kind of like the story you told earlier, right? Sometimes sometimes the decision, and again, maybe it's not enough discovery, but sometimes despite the best efforts, some percentage of those people aren't going to close, and the deal is not going to happen. And it's not a function per se of a bad experience, although certainly in many cases it is.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there's always exceptions to every rule, right? But it's for me, no decisions in my experience have been is they boil down to unanswered questions, right? If you look at the way people make decisions and adopt change, they have stages and that they go through. And I remember reading a research paper about this pretty early in my sales career. And what found is that people won't move from one stage to the next. And the paper is actually about adopting change, right? Which buying fundamentally is, right? Adopting change. That they won't move from one stage to the next of making the decision about adopting a change if they have unanswered questions. And so, okay, for me, and through my own experience, I found this out is, when deals stall, deals go quiet, or you get to a point and there's no decision, it's because we screwed up somewhere in discovery. We didn't really learn what was most important to them. We didn't, we can sort of take it from there because everything sort of cascades off that. If you don't know that, what are you selling? Well, it's not aligned with what their vision is, what they need to achieve to be successful with this investment. So you can sort of.
I'm going to tell you that's been my biggest takeaway. So I know that it was. I got that out of this podcast. That if people listen to nothing else but that one question, it's worth the time because that question. What's interesting about it, Andy, is I do it myself, and I've shared it with lots of people. We have many new people. I'm realizing now I haven't shared it with, but the simple reality is, if you just knew that, it can go a long way to solving all the problems that we've covered here. So it's thanks for sharing that. And
thank you. But it also gets back to something you had talked about too, which is how important listening is, and it's hard for people, right? I get into my book, the difference between hearing and listening is it like everything else you do in sales, you have to be intentional about listening. You have, instead of listening to respond, which is sort of the default motion that many sellers use, is you have to listen to understand. And I love this great quote I have in the book from Clayton Christensen, who said, "Questions are the places in your mind where answers fit. If you haven't asked the question, the answer is nowhere to go."
It's good.
And you got to keep listening. To ask great questions, you got to listen. What do they want to hear next? What's the follow-up question? I mean, that's a big gap, is asking great follow-up questions. So you really dig deeper and then listen some more. And that's why I talk about this chasm between knowing and understanding. Is it's enough rep can do a reasonably good job of asking the questions they typically ask of buyers and gathering that information. But then what do you understand about the buyer?
Yeah. Oh, it's great. Andy, I know we're coming up. I've got a quarter of, that I got to jump on. So,
well, it's been fun to talk.
What can we do to? Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground here.
Well, we'll have to do it again because people don't know who are listening to this, but we've done this in 2 parts. So hopefully the parts fit together seamlessly. But we'll have you back and we'll extend the conversation.
That sounds great, Andy. It's a real pleasure, and wishing all the best for a great holiday.
Well, you too. And so if people want to learn more about your book, because that's what we're talking about, Mastering Virtual Selling, Orchestrating Sales Success, as I said, with a forward by our friend Frank Cespedes, where can they find that?
Yeah, I would encourage them to go to masteringvirtualselling.com. We've got not only the information on the book there, but also an arsenal. And the arsenal is a concept that we describe in the book that covers all kinds of useful resources to help you on the journey towards mastery.
Excellent.
So masteringvirtualselling.com. It's also available Amazon and all the
places you normally buy. All right. Well, Mark, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, friends, that's it for this episode. First of all, I want to thank you for taking the time to listen. As always, I'm so grateful for your support of the show. And I want to thank my guest, Mark Magnacca, for sharing his insights with us today. If you enjoyed this episode, please remember, subscribe to this podcast, Sales Enablement with Andy Paul, on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Certainly appreciate your help with that. And we also thank you so much for investing your time with me today. Until next time, I'm your host, Andy Paul. Good selling, everyone.